And next up we have Ramya Ramaswami talking about differences in readership metrics and media coverage among published studies in New England Journal.
Thank you very much. My name is Ramya Ramaswami. I was an editorial fellow last year at the New England Journal of Medicine, and I'm delighted to present to you today the differences in readership metrics and media coverage among published studies at the New England Journal of Medicine. So we think about a young researcher who has just completed her study and is looking forward to sending it for publication at a journal. And I'm sure one of the things that she's thinking about is, oops. Oh. She's wondering where her slides are. One of the things she's thinking about is who's going to see her study, and will it be cited? And I'm sure that the editorial team that are reviewing her paper and are considering her paper are also thinking about the same thing. And we're lucky nowadays in that we can measure views, citations, and media coverage much easier than we previously could. But what about when the study has a negative outcome? So when this is the case, and previous studies have looked at this, investigators might be reluctant to submit those studies for publication. Moreover, many journals get a lot of criticism about not publishing enough negative studies. But what's unknown is whether there are any differences in the metrics, such as media coverage, citations, and online views among negative studies compared with those that have a positive outcome. So that was our hypothesis. We wanted to check whether post-publication metrics between positive, negative, and mixed studies were the same. So just to take a step back, my colleagues at the past peer review Congress presented data that was published on published papers from the New England Journal of Medicine. Here we have studies from 2010, and on the x-axis we can see the number of online views in comparison with the citations. Now, what we saw at the time was a clustering effect. Most studies were in the bottom left-hand corner, and we had a few studies at the top right-hand corner in cluster 4, where they were highly viewed and highly cited. But what's not clear in this graph is what were the outcomes of these studies. Are they positive, negative, or mixed studies? And so this was the other question we wanted to ask. So how do we define positive, negative, and mixed studies? So positive studies are where the primary endpoint was met and it was a positive outcome. Negative studies, again, where the endpoint was not met. And mixed studies are those that can be open to interpretation. So I have two examples. The first where authors have two primary endpoints, one of which was negative and one which was positive. So an example would be progression-free survival and overall survival. And in another case where a treatment may have shown benefit, the adverse events were excessive and therefore perceived to be a mixed study. So we looked at, taking a view of how we measured the outcomes, the post-publication metrics, all studies that are published on our website have page views, citations, and media coverage listed, and they're updated every day. And there are 3 platforms that we used for measuring these metrics. So Adipon is our online publisher, and Crossref and Altmetric are used by many online publishers as well. So we looked at studies that were published between 2012 and 2015. There were over 6,000 articles that were published. 832 were original research articles. We limited these to 338 where there was an intervention or drug in a population. and found that 66% were deemed to be positive, 22% were negative, and 12% were perceived to be mixed. So looking at the citations overall, the mean number of citations were not statistically significant. We plotted the number of page views over time, and also when looking at the mean number of page views across the three groups, these results were not statistically significant. Just so we know, I think there is an error in the way that the results have been posted on the screen. So if anyone's interested, I'm happy to discuss that with you later. And finally, when we looked at media coverage, the mean number of media coverage across the three groups were also not statistically significant. When we looked at the question that we discussed earlier, which was the page views and the citations, we found a positive correlation between the number of page views and citations for the published studies that we looked at. And when we superimposed whether these studies were positive, negative, or mixed, we found that there was an overlap of positive and negative studies. And the one outlier in the corner was a published study from 2013 looking at the Mediterranean diet and on cardiovascular disease. So there are a few limitations I'd like to discuss. The first being the definition and classification of positive, negative, and mixed studies. Although there was a high concordance among the investigators who looked into this within our group, I imagine that if you were to increase the sample size, perhaps you could argue that the delineation between these groups may differ. The second thing was also the issue of time on the publication of the studies. We didn't look at the time effect and the calendar year of publication. The third thing is the issue about heterogeneity among these published studies. So the first is the authors and which institution they come from. The second is the number of patients and the actual condition that these patients have also influences how it's perceived in the media and the number of citations. The third thing is, although many of our studies were randomized controlled trials, study design does have an influence on the post-publication perception. Of course, we'd like to think that the negative studies that are published in the New England Journal are different, and we would perceive them to have a different audience to perhaps other negative studies published in other journals. So I think it would be best to think about collaborating and opening up the other journals that publish negative studies as well. So to the researcher who is thinking about publishing her study, who's got the post-publication metrics on her mind, I would reassure her that from our small study, we did find no significant difference between the post-publication metrics between positive, negative, and mixed studies. I would reiterate to her that she should think about the medical community and the effect of her research on her patients. Thank you very much.
Really nice talk, and I have a question. I wonder if, in order for a positive paper to make it into a New England Journal of Medicine, it takes less effort, whereas if you have a negative paper and you have to be working on something really huge or really relevant, so there's some sort of selection bias in terms of you're picking on the more important negative paper, but you're including a mixture of important and not quite important positive paper. So that might account for there's no difference in the number of views. That's just my thought.
I think that's a great observation, and I think I highlighted that as potentially one of the limitations. Thank you.
Yeah, Ivan Oransky from Retraction Watch, and also relevant, I guess, NYU Journalism Institute. Very interesting and somewhat surprising in a nice way. I'm wondering, and I just want to echo what you said, and we'll turn this into a question, but about looking at other journals as well. New England Journal is, I'm sure those of you who are at New England Journal would agree that you are unique in many ways, but I'll point out a few. One is that New England Journal does not actually send out press releases. So they send out an embargoed sort of press information kit, for lack of a better term, which includes all of the studies. That's key because most journals that issue press releases and have the kind of sort of weight of New England Journal, only peer review, wrong meeting. Only press release ones that they have decided might be of interest. So there's almost a artificial in the sense of the way that things are normally done in terms of press releasing that I think could play a role here because although yes, we journalists of course are making choices about things, at the end of the day we know from other studies that what's press released tends to get covered. So here, nothing's press released technically, or everything is press released. And so it's very interesting to me, and I would love to see what would happen if you looked at other journals and whether or not something was press released, because here it sort of was all.
Yeah, and on that point, I thank the organizers for picking our abstract, because I think that we're in a very unique position as a journal that does publish high quality research, and our practices are unique, and as a result, I think yeah, I agree. It would be interesting to look at other journals. Thank you. Oh, we may need to pick the mic on the back.
Hi.
I think I can just about hear you, so.
Well, I think for the live stream thing.
Oh, here we go.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Laura Maggio from Uniform Services University. I wondered if you considered for the media attention, what was the public accessibility of those articles? Were people going to hit a paywall when they went there? And how many times did you hit a paywall before you stopped clicking links from newspaper articles?
Yeah, it's a very good question. We didn't account for that in our study. Many of the major high-impact journals, again, we weren't able to quantify which articles were firstly behind a paywall and secondly were freely accessible. The other issue is that some articles, even though they're referenced a year ago, may be accessible if they're opened up as part of our access. So that's a very interesting question and we didn't look at it, I'm afraid.
Well, just quickly, in my research, we saw for 2016, 68% of the articles linked from newspaper stories were closed access. So the public was shut out of those.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Christine Rasmussen from the Nordic Cochrane Center. Thank you for a very interesting talk. I wanted to ask whether you have any data on drug advertisements, whether or not you could see any trends in that, and you're looking into that or have looked into it.
Again, interesting question. Many of the articles that we included were drug interventions, but many weren't. And so we didn't specifically look at the correlations for where drug ads were involved. But again, it might be an interesting thing to look at. Yeah. But we know the value of, or not so much the value of subgroup analyses. So have to think about that one. Thank you, though.
If we're done with the questions, thank you very much.